Hi, everybody. This is Brad Johnson, reporter with the Texan News. I'm here with State Rep Jared Patterson, two-term state rep from Frisco. Jared, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We're at the Republican Party of Texas Convention. It's really big, but it's only just starting, and so there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. We'll see how it turns out. But Jared, thanks for making the trip over. You are one of the lucky state reps, if I remember correctly, who did not have either a primary or a general election.
That's right.
And so you've been helping your colleagues get reelected, but also one issue you've been working on a lot during this time is explicit materials in schools.
Yeah.
Tell us about what you're finding in these schools, especially in your district, and what you're doing to address it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's almost harder not to have an opponent because you spend as much time traveling all over helping, all your friends to get reelected, but certainly it's a blessing to be able to get back down there officially, already. So this issue with sexually explicit books, it's one of these things where we keep having to legislate things that we didn't know that you had to legislate. For example, last session, we passed the Save Women's Sports Act, right? Legislating that boys can't compete against girls in women's sports. Didn't know that you had to pass a law for that. Thought that was just common sense, but here we are.
Yep.
This book issue kind of falls into that same realm where who thought that sexually explicit, and when I say sexually explicit, I mean extremely graphic, both illustrated and just in the written word, that these extremely graphic, sexually explicit, and pornographic materials, who would have thought that we would have to say, hey, this shouldn't be in the school library, y'all need to get rid of this. And so that's really what we've been dealing with. Number one, educating my constituents and others around the state that this is an issue, highlighting the books that we found, because I didn't believe it at first either.
Yeah.
But then also pushing, both at the local level to get districts to change policies to, number one, get the books out aggressively, root out the books. But number two, make sure that they pass policies that means that there aren't going to be them moving forward. Let's pass some higher standards. The TEA recently came out with a model library book policy. They didn't have one before. You know why? Because the adults used to be in charge, and we didn't put porn in the school library when the adults were in charge. So I think the world is starting to wake up to the fact that this issue is a real issue, that these things exist. Parents are challenging books through the formal process that many districts have, and they're reaching out to their state representatives and saying, hey, I don't want this crap in my schools. And so that's really what we've been working on. And
you and I have messaged about some of these examples before, and to use the old SCOTUS quote, you know it when you see it, pornography. Yeah. And some of these are just egregious.
Yes.
It's clear as day. So what are the responses you're getting from school districts on this issue, and how quickly do you think they're going to solve the issue?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know when you see it, and it is unmistakable in these examples. I mean, I'm not talking about innuendo. I'm not talking about thought-provoking literature. We're talking about basically a hustler magazine in some of these books. I mean, we're talking about the worst of the worst, right?
And there's illustrations, and there's also descriptions.
Yeah, and the illustrations are awful because I mean, it's close-up, full-on illustrations. But in the written word, I mean, you're talking about every possible detail of a sexual encounter that are every possible detail that you could imagine, and probably some that you couldn't imagine in the written word in these books. So it's a major, major issue. The responses has kind of been a mixed bag, honestly. At first, there's kind of shock and awe of, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is here. And then it's, okay, how are we going to respond? Prosper ISD up in my area had kind of that shock and awe moment of, oh my gosh. But then they quickly went into action. They've removed 38 books from their school libraries that they no longer have available. And they did that in a very quick manner. Then you had the Frisco ISD example, Frisco ISD where I live, where all three of my children go, where it was deny. The superintendent continued to downplay. He said, look, we've got 1 million books. This has been one book. Then he said it was 2. Now he's saying it's 6. We know it's more than that. It's just, as we continue to push, we're forcing the issue. And we're forcing them to change policies at the local level. But nationally, we're also having an effect. We met with a company called Permabound. Permabound is a family-owned book company, a library book company. They sell books nationally. They sold some of the sexually explicit books that we found in schools. Their national sales manager came into my district office, hat in hand, completely embarrassed, outraged that these books were books that they had sold, and that's a whole different story about how they get into the process. But they came hat in hand. They had pulled 40 titles nationally that they are no longer selling.
Wow.
Then we had a meeting with a company called Follett, who is the largest library book company nationally, and it was completely the opposite. It was so bad. Representative Shaheen and I were in this meeting together in my district office. It was so bad we got up and walked out because they said, we will only stop selling these books if you force us to legislatively. And if you force us to, even though these books are reprehensible, we're still going to sell them to other states if they want them. Mm-hmm. Basically saying greed has taken over. We're all about the cash. We're all about wokeism and not getting into a Twitter battle with the far left. We stand for nothing. We only stand for selling whatever books that the districts want to buy.
And you've mentioned before, some of these schools don't even know the books are there when they purchase these literally thousands of book bundles, right? And that's how they kind of slip in.
Yeah, look, there are a few radical librarians that want to push this agenda. We found one at Reedy High School in Frisco who literally trains other librarians nationally about how to, quote, read woke, about how to, quote, bring in the white folks and educate them. We found the slide deck and posted that, publicly a few months ago. But that is by far and away the minority. Most of the teachers and librarians that I've spoken with are appalled by this. What happens is that in my area, I live in a very fast growth area, the fastest growing area in America over the last 20 years, okay? Frisco, Prosper, Little Elm, all these towns that have gone from, Frisco went from like 20,000 people 20 years ago to 225,000 people today, right? So massive growth. They're building all these schools right and left. Every year they're building at least one campus. They go out, they contract with a book vendor, for example, Follett. They say, I need 12,000 books for the library. Follett says, no problem, we'll sell you the books and we'll bring them in, we'll stock the shelves, we'll set up the displays. Your librarian walks in on day one and they've got library books. That's how it works. Now, the districts never changed policy to say, I want these pornographic books. They've had the same policy forever. I want nationally recognized books. I want award-winning books. I want highly rated books. The problem is that in 2022 America, the ratings agencies and the awards agencies are highly rating and even giving awards to these massively sexually explicit pornographic books. And so, the districts, unknown to them by and large, they're getting these books. The problem is how they've responded. Yeah. We're trying to hold the book vendors accountable. We're trying to say, look, you need to put economic pressure. No state is going to build more schools in the next 25 years than the state of Texas. If we band together and put economic pressure on the book vendors, we will have an effect nationally on the books that are sold in this country.
That'll likely be something that when you guys reconvene at the legislature in 2023, something's going to be conjured up there, I'm sure. The other issue I want to talk to you about is the power grid.
Yes.
Obviously, it has gained new relevance after 2021. Not many people paid attention before then to the thing that powered the state, really.
Yes.
Where are we at with both the physical reforms, the weatherization stuff that seems to be at least currently making its way along pretty well, and then also the possibly more important side of the market reforms that ERCOT is currently?
That's a good question. So, number one, when dealing with the electricity grid, you can't look at this thing in a vacuum. Okay, you cannot look at what happened that 1 week in February 2021 in a vacuum and say, this is the status of the grid. You have to look at the 20 years prior to that and say, these are the policies that were put into place that led to why we had this number of thermal units, natural gas fired generators or coal fired generators or nuclear generators to generate electricity. These are the policies that are in place which led to this amount of wind power on the grid or this amount of solar power on the grid. You have to look at all that. You cannot look at it in a vacuum. I happen to be the only member of the House or the Senate that's actually from this industry. I'm from the electricity industry. I saw the problems on the grid before it was cool, before everybody could even spell ERCOT. I was I was filing legislation in 2019 to address these issues. And thank God I put it on YouTube because I've been able to reference that material back, to my constituents and to my colleagues to say, okay, look, remember when no one else was talking about the grid? Like, here's where the problems are. So the real big problem that we have in our grid is that while over the last 5 years, while we have grown by over 1.5 million people, while we've gone from the 10th largest economy to the 9th largest economy in the world, we've had all this growth, all this expansion. No one is investing in reliable thermal generation, dispatchable generation, meaning when I go press the button that we need this number of megawatts on the system, it puts that many megawatts on the system. Okay?
In short, not reliant on something you can't control like wind or solar.
Like wind or solar,
Yeah.
That's right. So no one is investing in our state with these resources. And so you have to say, in a period of growth, why are they not investing? And it's because of the overwhelming influence that the federal production tax credit has had on wind power. The proliferation of wind power in our state is a result of this federal tax credit where they are actually paid whenever they produce power from the federal government, from your tax dollars that you're sending to the federal government are turning around and being paid to these wind farms. So their break even is at negative 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So they're in the money regardless of what happens. So people ran out because of that and built wind farm after wind farm after wind farm and flooded the market. What that did is it depressed prices to the point where no one else could make money by investing in a market. So that's why we continue to grow both economically and in population, and no one is investing in our grid with reliable sources of power generation. So that's a massive problem, right? Now, the winter storm also highlighted, now, granted, an act of God like no one could have predicted, right? I mean, the entire state of Texas covered in snow and ice and that cold of weather for that long period of time. You know, a lot of people say, well, why didn't these guys winterize? Well, they did. They just didn't winterize enough to meet what happened.
To meet Massachusetts weather, basically.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then the other part, and this is such a government problem to have, but there was a lack of paperwork. You know, these oil and gas producers didn't fill out the right paperwork to say, hey, you can't shut me off because I'm a critical load. Mm-hmm. You know, now they've done that now, but you know, they didn't fill out the right paperwork of all the things that sounds like a government problem. And so they were curtailed from the power company because the power company just sees meters. Yeah. So they're curtailed like everyone else was. And then, you know, they start freezing up. They cause a problem. They can't get the flow of gas to the natural gas guys to burn it to create electricity. So it was just problem after problem after problem. And I've got confidence that all of that has been addressed. The winterization's been addressed. The communication piece, the paperwork piece has been addressed. The bills that we passed that Governor Abbott signed into law have addressed those issues. There still are other issues on the grid. The PUC and ERCOT are working through. We've had a number of changes. The most substantial changes to our market in over 20 years have taken place in the last 12 months. And so I feel very confident of where we are, but we have to figure out a way to get more thermal, reliable generation sources. Now, and I'm sorry, let me just say this one other thing. I have been on a soapbox forever against wind power because I think it's the most ridiculous thing ever. I think it's the biggest mistake from an infrastructure perspective that the state of Texas has ever made, right? But I don't feel the same way about solar. Solar actually produces power when it's hottest in Texas. When we need power, solar produces power. Now, I'm not a crazy fan of all the incentives.
And the peak being in the mid-afternoon to early evening.
That's right. In the 4 summer months, June, July, August, September, from 3 to 7 p.m., that's when solar produces the most. That's when we need electricity the most. And so it can be a really good force in the state of Texas, and we're going to get there eventually, but still you've got the situation where the sun's not always shining and it can still be really hot and we still need power. So everything has to be backed up with thermal reliable sources of generation.
And the PUC and ERCOT are currently working through the market redesign. We've got a piece on the website they published in December. If you want to go read all that technocratic jargon.
Yeah, and it's great, by the way.
Thank you.
Good job on that.
Appreciate it. You can go see that there. It spells it all out. But that is going to be finalized later this year. I think they said earlier, back in May, like December-ish.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a state affairs meeting on June 22nd and 23rd. I'm not on state affairs, but I'm going to sit in on the one on the 22nd. ERCOT's going to be there. They're going to talk about it. The 23rd, I'll be in a Homeland Security meeting that's a joint hearing about the school shooting in Uvalde. But my point is that we're kind of at a crossroads right now. My concern is that the PUC drastically oversteps and creates a lot of additional costs on consumers that they don't need to make, and implementing what's called a capacity market. or load service entity obligation, where retail electricity providers will be forced to pay this extra fee that is in every other market in the United States. That will raise costs to consumers. I adamantly oppose that obligation because, number one, I don't believe in being paid for something that you don't produce, which is what we currently have in Texas. You get paid when you produce. But number two, it hasn't worked in every other market. Other markets still have massive problems, even with a capacity market. And so I'm adamantly opposed to this. We'll see what happens. I think some members of the PUC believe that they have the authority to implement this on their own. I would argue that the legislature should be the one to determine if we're going to go down that road. But we'll see what happens. I think the biggest problem that we have is that the last time we really went deep on this issue was in 1999 until this last year in 2021. And a lot of that institutional knowledge is gone. And so, it's just everybody has their own area of expertise, and there aren't just a ton of folks that are just really as into the weeds on this topic as what someone that has worked in the industry for almost 20 years, has.
Well, it's definitely a complex topic, hard to understand. And whenever the PUC does decide what it's going to do, we'll be following it at the Texan. I'll be writing about it. That'll do it for this segment. We'll be talking to more state officials here. Jared, Representative Patterson, we appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we look forward to seeing how things develop in the legislature next session.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.